the National Campaign for the Right to Education and the Use of Oil Resources at Education Policies. It all starts when pre-salt, a large oil field located under the seabed, is discovered with a volume of around 50 billion barrels. It is located in an 800-kilometer strip between the state of Espírito Santo and Santa Catarina. For being located in great depth, accessing it implies environmental risks and social economic impact. Therefore, exploiting pre-salt incurs financial compensation revenues paid by the oil companies to the state. In 2008, when the existence and the huge extension of this oil reserve was announced, the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education publicly positioned in favor of 100% of the pre-salt fund to be directed to education. This was the beginning of an intense journey through a field full of particularities in the oil world. The Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education proposal was strengthened when discussed at the 2010 National Conference of Education by initiative and pressure from itself and UNI, the National Association of Students. At the same year, the then President Lula passed law number 12,351/2010, stating all the pre-salt oil, natural gas, and hydrocarbons fluids exploitation and production would be done under a sharing agreement. In theory, a more beneficial way for the country.
Antes da descoberta do pré-sal, era adotado no Brasil o regime de concessão. No regime de concessão, a propriedade do petróleo produzido é do concessionário. E o Estado recebe uma parcela das receitas decorrentes dessa produção a título de royalty e, no caso do Brasil, uma outra parcela que a gente chama de participação especial. No regime de partilha, há uma inversão, né? Adota-se o conceito de que o Estado é o proprietário do petróleo e o contratado é que recebe uma pequena parcela dessa renda petrolífera. O Brasil passa, nesse cenário, a ser exportador de petróleo. A nossa capacidade de refino não vai acompanhar a curva de produção. Nesse cenário de grande exportação, o Brasil passa a afetar preços no mercado internacional. Dessa forma, é muito importante que o Estado seja o definidor da produção, da curva de produção. E isso não é possível no regime de concessão. Então, foi muito adequada a mudança no marco legal do setor petrolífero nacional que aconteceu com a Lei 2.351 de 2010 e a gente espera, né, que esse regime de partilha introduzido por essa lei seja mantido no Brasil.
The challenge for civil society at the time was to link the oil wealth that would start being generated to benefit education, the most effective and fair way of distributing the oil income. At the end of June 2012, in a historical date for the country, the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education talked to the Special Commission of the Chamber of Deputies into approving the use of 10% of the GDP in public education. However, it was not established where the resources would come from. The government reacted and articulated Appeal 162 of 2012, presented by its leader in the Chamber of Deputies, Arlindo Chinaglia. With the signature of 79 lawmakers, the document would take the Brazilian National Education Plan to the floor of the Chamber of Deputies, not to the Senate. It would take the discussions about the Brazilian National Education Plan back to the start. The network of the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education, practically alone and with the support of only some political parties, started the movement to have it dropped. With an online petition, they said that the deputies that would not withdraw their signature would be labeled enemy of education. In addition to that, the hashtag campaign, directed to each one of the lawmakers, greatly embarrassed all of them. In a few days, the petition had been signed by 6,000 people. The power of the public opinion mobilized by the press paid off, and more than a half of the deputies went back, dropping the appeal. With the defeat, the Brazilian government and the Ministry of Education decided to respond by looking for ways to make financing resources that could reach investment equivalent to 10% of the Brazilian GDP available for public education. the issue that most contradicts the federal government. The resolutions of the Brazilian National Education Conference were resumed, and President Dilma Rousseff's decision was to direct the oil income to education, taking up one of the proposals of the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education. In November, Deputy Carlos Zaratini was defeated at the Chamber of Deputies with his bill that brought up the federal government proposal. It was not a bold bill, but it was progressing. This event brought concern to the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education because it meant a step back in making the 10% of GDP available for public education. Upon being defeated, the Brazilian government drafted a provisional measure that would soon be abandoned due to the weakness of the bill itself, since it would result to almost no resources for education. A new bill was then proposed. The Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education acknowledged the intent of the government, but highlighted that more audacity was in need. The text was still far from the necessary level. On April 30, 2013, President Dilma Rousseff once again announced a timid bill in national television. At every initiative, the government distanced itself more from the fair amount of resources that would enable the financing goal of the Brazilian National Education Plan. But with the June 2013 protests, the paths of education financing took another route. The protests that started in São Paulo, organized by the Free Pass movement, had an unexpected result and revealed the population discontentment with the Brazilian politics in general. The government needed to answer the nation quickly. An audience was scheduled for June 25th with the presence of the General Coordinator of the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education, Daniel Cara, Senator Cristóvão Buarque, Deputies Carlos Zaratini and André Figueiredo, and representatives of the Oil National Agency. André Figueiredo, draftsman of the bill, mediated an agreement concerning the participation of the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education participation of the bill, a much more audacious document than the one published by the Brazilian government in April. Figueiredo's participation was vital for the progress. On the night of June 26, exactly 1 year after the Special Commission of the Brazilian National Education Plan approved the 10% of the GDP for public education, the Chamber of Deputies ruled in favor of the bill that would be sent to the Senate. A back-and-forth sequence started once again, where the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education worked for more funds for education. A fight driven by different interests, but that guaranteed the main claim of the civil society. On September 9th, President Dilma passed the law that directs 75% of oil royalties to education and 25% to health. And the most important, 50% of the pre-salt social fund to education. The original bill by the President herself estimated around 25 billion reals for the arena, accrued in a 10-year period. With the final document, the amount sums up to 66 billion that may be achieved as soon as 2024. The oil resources alone do not ensure the financing goal equivalent to 10% of the GDP for education. However, they mean a big step, much bigger than the one that would be achieved from the initial intention of the Brazilian government. One more victory that was only achieved thanks to the tireless fight of the Brazilian National Campaign for the Right to Education, and that shows how an organized civil society mobilization can contribute to building a new path for the history of Brazilian education. On August 12, 2015, the Education Commission of the Brazilian House of Representatives, in the name of the National Congress, awarded the Darcy Ribeiro Prize to Daniel Cara, General Coordinator of the campaign. It was an acknowledgement of the advocacy work developed by the Brazilian Campaign for the Right to Education in the construction of the National Education Plan, in the directing of both oil royalties and half of the pre-salt social fund to the field of education, and in the inclusion of cost of initial quality education per student, CAQI, and cost of quality education per student, CAQI, in the National Education Plan.